All right, so let's start with design of green roofs and the perception, the wisdom of design as it's expressed in presentations and how that gets developed. So let me see, Ed, you were mentioning that a lot of times the way a design is perceived or presented is somewhat simplistic or naive, or doesn't reflect the full reality of the project.
Well, I think what you see out in the marketplace is an assumption of ecosystem services being delivered from a green roof. And some of those, to my mind, seem to be in conflict with one another. And I don't know that plant selection is necessarily mapped to that at all. So I think you get, I guess there's a split in the marketplace that Linda and I wrote about, that we have a design solution that's possible for a green roof, or we have a product solution. So there's a marketplace for saying a certain sales force can come and say, well, we'll install a green roof, and of course you get all these services, and they just kind of plop in place. And I guess it comes full circle around to, we haven't really done the in situ field research to validate any of that. So I think we can see that there's plant survival or not plant survival. I'm not so sure that we're smart enough to know which plants, which soils, which assemblies are going to maximize or optimize those perceived ecosystem services.
Some of the early developments in green roofs in Germany, I noticed, because of all the incentives and the push to get green roofs installed there, created a lot of, initially, a lot of sort of slipshod installations because of the lack of available research available, the lack of available knowledge bases for green roofs. And I see that's happening in certain places in the U.S. as well, in North America as well, where there's a green roof required by the design, whether it's a public works project and they say we need a green roof. There's such a push to get the green roof in there that the understanding of what the green roof can do and how it will develop is not as important to the client as just getting it up there. Have you experienced that, Charlie, in your rather vast experience of doing green roofs in the U.S., North America?
Oh, yeah, I think there's a lack of curiosity on the part of most clients that are simply that start from the standpoint of simply having to put up a green roof. And so that means that the opportunities to have a dialogue with them about what they want it to look like in 5 years and what expectations they have, what the implications are for maintenance and ongoing management to achieve what they want. Those sorts of discussions don't happen because in many cases what's being provided is seen as a product that once installed continues to deliver what's promised, without active intervention. There's another client group, of course, which is very specific about what they want, and those clients need to be really given a range of options so that they can choose the most effective approach for what they're looking for.
The big drivers that I've seen in the market are stormwater retention, but that's starting to grow now, expand rather.
Well, I would say that the industry depends upon stormwater management and regulation of stormwater management as a driver to grow the industry. However, I'm sorry, I've lost the train of thought. Never mind.
Well, that's
somebody else.
A foot in the door to getting a broader array of services out of green roofs, and I imagine living walls eventually. But even now they're doing living walls for interior air cleaning, phytoremediation uses. But what I see happening more and more now, in the literature at least, is people advertising things like habitat support, food production, a little bit more on the energy side, looking at the cooling reduction, the cooling load reduction on buildings. But still, stormwater has been the big driving thing that's been instituted in all of the incentives. Usually city incentives more than county or state incentives.
Okay. The point I was going to make earlier is that these issues around regulation of stormwater in particular certainly are absolutely critical for the growth of the industry. However, most of the projects that we see built or many of the projects we see built are outside municipalities that have any kind of in-place regulation of any consequence. And I would say that a lot of projects that are getting built are about aesthetics and about some of these philosophical concepts that have to do with habitat creation or energy reduction and things of that sort. Those are the projects which are often not really carefully thought through in terms of what the objectives of the client are and how best to deliver a project which is going to satisfy their needs, their objectives, their desires, and also be affordable.
One of the things I noticed in design processes for green roofs was that one way to design a green roof is to look at a particular set of say what you have available on your roof to hold the weight of the green roof up, and selecting your plants and media, etc., to accommodate those restrictions. Another way to design is to find out what plants you need to achieve a certain result, and design an ecology or a habitat for them and a maintenance plan to keep those particular plants active. A particular example of this is phytoremediation, where you've got plants that will target certain toxins that you want to remove from water or soil or whatever. And even though there might be a pressure to have species succession, that pressure is resisted by the maintenance plan that keeps the original species selection intact. Robert, you've done some research on phytoremediation, and I know that Dr. Cameron has also done some at Penn State. Could you go through a little bit of some of the non-stormwater applications and research going into green roofs?
Well, from a phytoremediation standpoint, I mean, you can view a green roof like you would any other planting that you're going to use for that kind of a system, like a rain garden or anything else where you're going to dump contaminated water and expect the materials to take the plant material into the soil to treat that. And you can design a system that's effective. But kind of back to what Ed was saying a minute ago about design and where you started this whole conversation out. I agree with Ed and Charlie that one of the biggest problems is that we have this sort of one-size-fits-all design mentality. And so you're bringing up the idea of phytoremediation. Well, a phytoremediation roof is going to be a very, very different animal than something that's being put up there strictly for stormwater management. And to think that all you have to do is change the plant palette a little bit and maybe make the soil 6 inches deep or the media 6 inches deep instead of 4 inches deep, and you're going to call it a phytoremediation roof is probably a bit naive. Certainly there's going to have to be a lot of different maintenance practices, one being harvesting the plant material specifically, because if you're trying to remove contaminants, especially metals or anything like that, I mean, you can't make them go away. The only way to get rid of them is to harvest the plant material and remove them that way.
Sure. Just a side question. I had a professor that told me one time, he said, a burden shifted is not a burden lifted. And with phytoremediation, it's a good example of that. Has there been a lot of work on what you do after you harvest the plant materials that have, say, hyperaccumulated, metals?
Typically, what you do is you burn them, and then you concentrate the material that's left over. So you can actually harvest things. There have been examples of people growing, say, sunflower in a field that was contaminated, and then harvesting the heavy metals back out of the sunflower tissue. And long term, that's probably going to be something that we can do with some contaminated sites. I don't really see green roofs falling into this very much, though. We're starting out with a relatively non-contaminated system, and the rainfall that's falling on it is contaminated, but it's not heavily contaminated. It's not like a post-industrial brownfield site where you've got heavy amounts or large amounts of industrial metals and things that you're trying to clean up. I mean, we shouldn't really ever be dealing with that on a green roof, unless it's specifically designed to treat waste from a factory.
Mm-hmm. Well, Patrick, I would say that in green roof plant selection, there's somewhat of a hierarchical relationship. I mean, first, the plant has to live long enough to perform its function. So a lot of the field research that's been done on plants for whatever ecosystem service, the first thing you have to do is build the assembly so you have a long-term plant survival, or at least something alive, because generally dead plants don't perform many services. As a rule, and they would, you know, I think the kind of thumbnail back of the envelope calculations are a green roof returns its investment somewhere in the 20 to 30 year mark, and so if you're up every 4 or 5 years replacing plants and doing all that, you may never get to your return on investment. And there's not a long-term view of this. It's a done as a day of installation view. Like Rob said, there's an oversimplification of plant palettes per region, per design intent, per ecosystem service. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of a homogenization of plants and soils. And I'm not saying that those don't do some good. I'm just saying we don't currently play around with it enough to optimize it or really observe it in the field for any length of time, and maybe it hasn't been enough time. You know, maybe we're right where we should be because we're essentially a 10-year-old market.
I remember some of the studies, there was one study in particular out of Penn State, I believe it was Penn State, that talked about the monitoring of how well a green roof retains stormwater over an extended period of time. You know, as the roots of the plants developed, as the soil changed, etc., and the efficiency of the roof actually wound up increasing somewhat over time. And as I recall, the explanation for that was that as the roots developed, it allowed more surface area to be available to water flow through the roof, and as a result, there was more adhesion taking place in the soil. So it's not just an issue of what particular plants are going to serve a particular purpose. It's the whole system develops like an animal would develop. You know, there's a lifespan and a change of capacity as it is given birth, grows into adolescence, grows into you know, middle age, late middle age, and then where we all are right now. So,
well, I think that's especially true with stormwater quality, where you see a lot of the studies from universities. They install a green roof and then pour water over it, and they extract data that's, you know, that's true at that particular point in time. Very few people have gone to a 5 or 6 year old green roof and looked at stormwater quality, because it's going to look very different. I would imagine Rob would know better than I, but I can't imagine. I think the initial kind of, it's the same as the first flush. You're going to get a lot of humic acid and a lot of nutrient flow off a freshly installed roof.
So go on, Rob, sorry.
The nutrient content initially when you start out with all that compost that we put into the media and the starter fertilizer charge compared to something that's older. Eventually it comes down to management practices, though, in terms of water quality especially. If you fertilize the roof heavily, you're going to have fertility coming off the roof all the time. If you don't fertilize it heavily, it's going to be reduced. But there's a trade-off between having sufficient fertility to keep the roof alive and to not encourage the growth of undesirable species because there's nothing there for the desirable species to use, and the water quality issue. And I think it's one of the places, in terms of hype and in terms of stories that are out there that are probably not really quite true. We can't have runoff from the green roof have no nutrients in it. I mean, that's just not possible. You have to have nutrients in the system to keep the plants alive. It can be minimized and it can be managed, but the runoff from a green roof is never going to be as clean as the rainwater that hits it. It's just not going to happen.
Well, I think that's what I was speaking of at first, where you have conflicting ecosystem services there. If you're in an area with some sort of high atmospheric deposition that you want to manage with a roof, you're going to have to keep the soil lean enough and find a group of plants that can live in extremely lean soils, but they may not be high in nectar and pollen value, and so you may have a very low habitat roof. Or it may not be that ornamental and nice to look at. And I think the assumption is that these roofs do all these things all the time.
Some of the most stable roofs that we've seen are ones that have very low aesthetic value, but actually look like. And you showed some pictures of tundra, Ed, in your slides. But I've seen we have some roofs up that are you see a lot of open ground, open aggregate, where they're so lean and so drought tolerant that you have little spots of plants here and there, and the roots are holding the soil together, but it doesn't look anything like a garden, anything like a fully vegetated area. But it functions well in terms of runoff and contaminants from the runoff, but the aesthetic part of it is just not what the client would originally envision.
Well, this goes to having a discussion with the client at the outset in terms of what their objectives are. You can certainly, and we advocate, active management of roofs to maintain an aesthetic and also to refresh the biodiversity of the system and make it something which is beautiful and interesting. As well as meeting the bare requirements of providing some sort of treatment, some sort of media on the roof. And that's the sort of discussion very few people have with their clients, and it results in surprises that ideally would be avoided in a proper design process.
I find it interesting when you talk to a client about, well, do you plan on maintaining your landscape for your project, meaning the landscape at grade? They'll say, well, of course. And what's your maintenance plan for your roof? And it's almost as though they think it's a different topic. Oh, the roof is there. Well, that's taken care of. But we have to pay a lot more attention to the plants at grade because we associate maintenance with that. But what I've found is that a number of roofs, the ones that have won international design awards, etc., are being redesigned either by Mother Nature or by the maintenance staff as they develop, and which is interesting. Ed brought up a number of issues when I had conversations with him about maintenance regimes, and the fact that plants have lifespans. I mean, even if you have perennials, it doesn't mean that every perennial is going to last forever. You have certain perennials will live longer than others. Some will self-seed, some won't. And so a roof, it's like a marriage. Once you get the green roof in there, you're committed to a maintenance relationship with it in some way. Ed, could you talk a little bit about post-installation maintenance issues as they relate to the long-term history of a green roof?
Well, I think you have to think about maintenance toward design because it's a financial commitment and a time commitment and an expertise commitment. So if you're, say, you're a facilities director for a college or university, you would want to know in the design process what assets you have to bring to bear to this roof. Now, a real successful example of that is Swarthmore University outside Philadelphia, where they have 2 or 3 people on staff now that have become very excited about the green roofs, and they have an idea how they want to maintain them. And they really manage those roofs with a plan. And as they build more roofs, they are pushing their maintenance plan up through the design process. And I think that's the ideal state that comes from, they have lived with green roofs and seen, okay, we've got this freely self-sowing native grass. Maybe we don't want that in the spec the next time because it's starting to occupy too much of the roof and cost us too much time. On the plus side, it is a nice native grass and it may provide a service, but we're outside of our time budget to control this thing on the roof, and we don't want it to be 100% grass roof. So they're kind of going through that experience and then staying to the next, as they keep adding buildings in their portfolio, they are using their maintenance experience to inform their design choices. And I think that's an interesting path. And let's face it, we're not going to get many of our ecosystem services from roofs unless we have them at a fairly significant scale. So the campus environment, whether it's a city or a college or a corporate campus, they're going to need a lot of buildings with green roofs, and they're going to have to start informing their designers through their experience.
Rob, how old is research in North America on green roofs? I mean, how old are some of the older roofs that are being examined and researched?
Well, the oldest roofs we have on campus are some little garden sheds that are about 10 or 12 years old now, I guess. And that's the oldest research roof in North America that I'm aware of. Most of the roofs that people are playing around with are 5 years old or less, maybe 6 or 7. And even the ones I'm playing around with on our campus, most of the large-scale roofs are much younger. I would get back to Ed's comment though about, and yours too, about the landscape issue. I think it's naive to think that a roof as a landscape is any different than the same landscape on the ground. I mean, if I planted a sedum meadow or a sedum carpet on the ground as part of our arboretum, I would expect to do some maintenance to maintain that sedum meadow. And I would also expect it to change over time. I mean, we put in an arboretum at grade here at Penn State a couple of years ago. The plants that you put in there are basically a starter set, but it's going to change over time. And if you don't actively change it over time, it's going to change over time by itself. That's just going to happen.
I find, too, that in the absence of direction, the maintenance staff will sometimes take over the design responsibilities of the roof. And I know several award-winning roofs in my area where the maintenance staff is actually redesigning the roof. They find species that were originally selected that are no longer appropriate or no longer working. And with or without doing research, they'll come in with their alternatives. I've seen the same thing with homeowners that just start, saying, "Oh, this is sort of neat. I went to Home Depot and got a seed packet. Let's see what works," and throws it up there. Interesting experiments, but they frequently don't have a lot of scientific rigor behind them.
No, we do that on campus, though. I mean, I have my green roof class every year plant some new plants up on the roof, and we deliberately pick things that some are going to die out and some may survive, and some. You think about managing a roof for aesthetic purposes. We deliberately plant annuals up there every year on the ones that are highly visible, simply because you can't get that level of color from anything that's going to be up there perennially, and that way we can fill in the holes. So, sure. It's all about the management and the maintenance and what it is you expect the thing to look like, and it's the same thing that we do with all the at-grade landscapes. I don't view a green roof as being significantly different from a landscape standpoint than the same thing at grade.
Sure. Here's a question for all of you. I'd like to talk a little. We've gone pretty much into the 40 minutes or whatever that we're going to be edited down to. In the time remaining, I'd like to talk a little bit about appropriate training and educational development that has to be brought to bear for this topic, whether it's design, installation, maintenance, or research. Suggestions, experiences about strong points and weak points and what's available in terms of expertise in the field and training and education in the field.
You want me to start there?
Hey, I'll run my mouth if there's a silence. I get nervous, so
Okay,
I'd rather have you talk, though.
I'll start on that one. I think the makeup of this panel is a pretty good indication of the kind of expertise that you want to have a successful green roof. I mean, you need someone
Carey.
who understands horticulture, the plant physiology, the soils. You need someone who knows what plants grow where and how to grow them where they are, and you need someone who's doing the engineering because it's actually on a roof. And I think there's a disconnect in the training. I mean, I certainly see it with like our landscape architecture program. I mean, they know how to design something and it's very pretty, but there's not a lot of interest in or understanding of the soils or anything else underneath it, or the system function underneath it. So, I mean, I see that with roofs a lot, where the landscape architect will come in and specify a plant palette, and it's lovely and it's wonderful and it provides all kinds of great ecosystem services, but they haven't talked to the engineer and they don't know what needs to go on below that. And they haven't talked to the soil scientist and they don't know what needs to go on below that. So it's really kind of a marriage of a lot of different areas.
How is Oh yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, I just say that every roof, and we've done hundreds of them, is its own creature. And to think that you can take a course or abstractly learn the lessons of green roof design and maintenance is false. We learn from every single project, and we continue to. I mean, fundamentally, you have to make a commitment to each one of these projects and follow them and adapt with them, because no matter how smart you think you are about anticipating issues of drainage and soil properties and plant selection and microclimate, anticipating microclimates, you are going to be surprised. And the more projects you are physically on and have your preconceptions demolished time and time again, the more reliable you're going to be as an advisor to a client, and the better you're going to be at being able to intervene and turn guide the process of the development of these projects.
Well, Patrick, I would just add, I think Charlie's exactly right and Rob's exactly right. I think ultimately, if you want to look at a future state of what would be a certificate of expertise or something like that, it would eventually have to include a practicum of some kind that you could demonstrate in the classroom a fundamental knowledge of terminology, of field conditions, hypotheticals, but just like a doctor or a dentist, you would want someone with field experience eventually. I don't know how you put that through a pipe and run it through an organization, but we don't really have in the U.S. in the landscape and horticulture trades like a trade schools like they do in the rest of the world. So our people that come into the field don't come through practicums most of the time. They come through academic experience, and it is humbling. And I've seen it from working in nurseries for a long time. The people that come out of college are sure that what they've learned is correct, and then they hit the cold reality of the nursery, and I think the supply chain also has to learn, because I'm not sure all the products and materials are equal, and so there's if you want to be qualified to pick those, you have to really understand those individual constituent materials and then how they fit together in the field, and there's no way to understand that in the abstract.
No, I agree. It strikes me that when you generally in four-year university education, the leaning is toward the white-collar, design-oriented kind of knowledge base, whereas through the trades or even in some aspects with community colleges, it's much more toward the application emphasis. I don't know a lot of the only program I know of in North America is at BCIT that has successive British Columbia Institute of Technology that has something like 6 different courses, all related to green roofs that are different levels. Usually, like at Rob's, like at Penn State, I believe there's like one course that generally supplements some other discipline, like landscape architecture or horticulture or something. It's interesting. I know coming from architecture, the only thing we ever learned about plants was how to scribble them in presentation drawings to soften the hard edges of the planes that we were designing. But the soil is, to me, it winds up being the big the rocket science of the industry. That and the horticulture. What do you think would in training, in doing the GRP classes through Greenroofs for Healthy Cities, the 101 through 401, most of the people that take those take it from the standpoint of try to reinforce something a discipline they already know. So, for instance, the horticulture people will really focus on the horticulture part of that training, but look forward to delegating the roof membrane stuff to somebody else, because that's part of that's their thing. Do you see as a group, do you guys see in the future green roof living wall design and research encompassing more and more fields, but also getting to the point where there might be a higher stratum of accreditation, I guess you'd call it? You all come from different disciplines. I mean, Charlie comes from soil, Ed comes from plants. Rob, I'm not quite sure about your horticulture, basically, right? That's your background? I know that originally people like Kelly Luckett came from roofing. I'm still really intrigued at how we can move to the next level of green roof understanding for a professional designation level beyond just taking one course or getting a GRP certificate, which we all know is relatively. It's more like a GED than a PhD.
I have to argue, along with Charlie, that it's all really about experience beyond that book learning. I mean, you can learn that stuff, but well, for example, in horticulture at Penn State, if you're getting a degree in horticulture, you have to do at least one internship with some business related to what it is that you want to do, and that might be with somebody like Charlie, or for some of my students, it might be at a greenhouse or a nursery or a landscape company. But there's no substitute for actually being out there and getting your hands dirty. I mean, you can read about this stuff all day long, but you're not going to see it. And the more actual field experience you get, the better you're going to be at it. So, I mean, I guess if I were going to take the certification practices up another level, it would be to require that someone have a certain number of years or a certain number of projects of field experience behind or underneath their belt before they could get that next level of certification.
What do you see the relationship between the design professionals and the installation professionals in the field on projects? And mostly here I'm talking about commercial projects, large projects.
I would say one of the things that is a truth on virtually every project we do is that what you encounter in the field is always different than what's on the drawing. Even if what's on the drawing is accurate, there are conditions that are a surprise. And that the actual reality of the space that you're encountering when you start building a project is different than the abstraction that comes from the design process. There are very few designers which follow their process through the field adjustments and myriad decisions that go into actually building a workable project. And I think that is a limitation imposed by the way we do design in this country. and I think it's important that designers are more a presence in the field, and unless they can take back to their desks the knowledge of seeing, what happens at certain sorts of transitions and how drainage is affected and how different sorts of wind and exposure conditions affect the design, it's not going to result in an improvement over time in design.
Charlie, are you suggesting that designers should be dragged kicking and screaming back to previous projects?
I think designers should, out of their own interest, want to go back and see these projects. But I think it's. I think you can. I think particularly in a field which the margins between success and failure are so narrow. We're dealing with extreme environments to begin with, which means small decisions made about certain variables about types of drainage and types of plants and thickness of soil and irrigation or not irrigating or placement near a window and on and on and on. Seemingly small decisions have large impacts. And those are usually dealt with in practice by making a field adjustment. As you say, the person that's doing the management of the project over a period of time may accommodate the realities of the actual installation and may participate in sort of redesigning it, re-engineering it to be more adapted to its actual environment, which means that a lot of these projects 5 years out have departed very far from the design intent of the original designers. And we can just accept that as a reality, or we can encourage, through whatever means, to have landscape design professionals which are invested in both observing and participating in installation of these projects, but also tracking them.
Mm-hmm. It's been my experience too that landscape professionals have traditionally been drawn upon not to have their products be so mechanically tied to the performance of a structure. Landscaping has generally been other kinds of things, usually aesthetic, but when you get to the point where you have to come up with certain stormwater retention performance on a roof or certain other kinds of performances on a roof, those criteria are rarely shared at grade level.
Well,
now,
I just like to.
There are exceptions with regard to bioswales and rain gardens and stuff like that. But
I just like to make one comment about performance with regard to stormwater, and that is, we've given lip service to green roofs being an important part of our current design vocabulary because of their perceived importance in stormwater management. However, there is a very, very low level of sophistication in terms of actually understanding how green roofs perform hydraulically and hydrologically, and frankly, very little interest in filling that gap. So it's interesting that the regulations which do exist around stormwater management make certain primitive assumptions, most of which are only partly true, and many of which, or all of which, are likely not ever to be tested. And this not only is about green roofs, this also pertains to ground BMP low-impact development measures, right? It's expensive to find out the truth. It's easier to have a sort of a gentleman's agreement among designers and engineers and regulators that we will assume certain things, and that becomes the basis of design. So, I mean, if we're really talking about design here, that's a different animal than sort of working inside this regulatory environment, which is more about is not so interested actually in getting to the bottom of the science.
We have a few more minutes left. In that time, I'd like to talk a little bit about what you think is what we all, as a group, but what we all think is are the most the areas in need of the most development in terms of our knowledge and understanding of green roofs, whether it's from the standpoint of areas of research that are being neglected or getting short-shrifted, areas of training. Where if we had to put out some fires, where would we put them out now? Okay, areas of research, subjects of research.
Do you want me to start?
Sure. There, go ahead.
Well, I mean, from my perspective as a nurseryman, what I would like to see is this. There's kind of a dual untruth right now, and that's that sedums work on all roofs, and that sedums are ecological deserts. You have two very vocal camps that vilify sedums, and then another camp that uses them universally. And I think it shows that the local, regional, and service understanding of the horticulture on green roofs is very low. So I think as knowledge rises, those two perceptions will tend to bleed away because we'll have true understanding in each particular climate, microclimate, or design intent about plant performance. And that's not going to be learned except by going on roofs and having Rob's student punch in some plant that someone says, I think this will work, and everyone else says no, or watching what the wind blows in, I mean, it's an observational science. And then it's got to run through production horticulture and make sure you can produce it at a reasonable price where someone's going to buy it. And then assemble it with other components with enough expertise in the field that the poor plant has a choice. So I would like to see a lot more horticulture look.
Rob, in terms of research, where do you think the big gaps are?
Well, I mean, I think one of the clear problems is we have this concept of the media and one size fits all, and we're going to put one green roof media on a roof at any given depth of soil, and it's going to support all these different plants. We don't do that in the landscape. I mean, if you're landscaping an area, you're going to look at the different soil types, and you're going to select plant material that's adapted to the soil type, because that's going to provide you with better success long term. I mean, I think we need to get to that level of sophistication on the green roof, too, in terms of matching media to plant selection, media depth to plant selection, what Charlie was saying, drainage components on the roof to your plant palette and plant design, too. And I think that's one of the places where the design really breaks down, is that, we're all designing, or we're designing these things sort of in isolation from the other components of the roof. I mean, the plant materials are being selected, and if they're doing any kind of thinking about the design, I mean, their response is just to change the media depth from 4 inches to 6 inches to support the different plants. Well, I mean, I guess that works, but it's not really at the level of sophistication that we need to be at if you really want to design a roof to have a wide biodiversity and maintain that biodiversity over time.
Sure. It was interesting when I believe Ed was talking about taking into account the maintenance implications of every plant you have on your palette, and deciding not only that, but what does it need to thrive, and what is it going to need to develop throughout its lifespan on the roof in terms of maintenance.
I had a conversation a few years back about, I mean, if you really want a diversity of plant communities on a roof, you need a diversity of soils on the roof, or a diversity of media on the roof, because the two go hand in hand. And we don't do that. I mean, the roof is all one media, and all we change is depth and maybe a little bit of the subsurface drainage components underneath.
To wrap up, if we had to isolate or think about some glaringly obvious or glaringly areas of hype within what the naive market would look at a green roof for, where do you think the largest areas of the most glaring hype are right now, currently in the market, where people, where there's, yeah, exactly, that's. Where's the hype right now in the market? Where's the biggest amount of not outright deception, but exaggeration of claims, vagueness of information now being sort of generally advertised in terms of green roofs as a product?
I would agree with Charlie. It's probably on the function of the roof from a stormwater standpoint, and I would also add the function of a roof from an energy standpoint. The models are, especially from an energy standpoint, a lot of the models are just based on empirical data or someone thinking about what it's going to do, and they're not really based on any kind of research. Some of them are. Yeah, it's we make a lot of assumptions, and a lot of that's from regulatory hype. I mean, I guess it's just regulatory hype rather than anything else, but we make all these assumptions about a 4-inch roof is going to hold 2 inches of water regardless of what the antecedent conditions are, the preceding conditions, you know, regardless of the plant community on the roof, the health of the plant community, everything else that's going on, we still say it's going to hold 2 inches of water every time it rains, and of course that's not really true.
One of the things that I've seen, and not only in the trades but also in the design professions, is that there is a lack of willingness for one design professional or one trade to put themselves in the shoes of another. Even though we've been at green roofs for a while, the people that want to see mechanical performance in terms of stormwater still don't want to understand or try to understand the horticulture better. The people that are doing the waterproof membrane still don't really want to get interested too much in the horticultural aspects of it. That green roofs are still viewed by a lot of designers as a building component like drywall or bricks or steel columns versus something that's living that will evolve.
Well, if your business is selling soil, you're going to be interested in soil. If it's selling waterproofing, it's going to be waterproofing. If it's plants, it's going to be plants. So it's forgivable that people provide the elements that go into a green roof are focused on what generates revenue for them. And to the extent possible, not getting in the way, not letting other aspects of the design get in the way of selling their product. That's perfectly logical and reasonable and acceptable. What's lacking, for the most part, in the industry are businesses which are providing not a component, but providing a completed installation together with its support over a period of time. There are very few companies like that out there. And that, to me, is the solution to the problem. You want someone who is less interested in selling a component than finding the right component and then understanding how that component works and learning from its performance and working with the client over a period of time to follow that roof on its trajectory, with the understanding that there will be a trajectory, that it's not the idea isn't to hold the installation in place, but to allow it to become what it's going to become in a intelligent, active way that results in an outcome everyone's pleased with. Until the provider of the system has that mentality that they're providing that kind of a service to the client, you're not going to see that many projects where there's this integrated view of green roof design.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm giving a note. I'm giving a little. I have a little message here that says I have to wrap up soon. So that might be a good time to wrap up. Any last or final comments by anyone on the panel?
I would just agree with Charlie that, I mean, the problem is that we don't treat them as landscapes. I mean, bottom line is that we're treating the roof as a building, or what you said too, Patrick. We're treating it as a building element, and it's not. It's a landscape.
Mm-hmm. Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much